They thought she was just a quiet technical consultanta, middle-aged woman with a worn duffel bag and calm, unreadable eyes. Inside a billion-dollar military base, they mocked her, dismissed her, certain she had nothing to offer. But minutes later, when a state-of-the-art drone was spiraling toward disaster, that same woman stepped out of the shadows. And when the truth came out, the entire base stood at attention, saluting a living legend they once believed was dead. The Nevada sun beat down on an endless stretch of cracked earth surrounding Black Ridge Test, Ranhea military facility, so classified it didn't exist on any map. The heat shimmered off the ground like ghosts rising from the past. And in the middle of it, stepping down from a dusty black transport, was a woman in plain desert fatigues, clutching a single weathered duffel bag. No insignia, no rank, no fanfare, just a quiet arrival and the crunch of gravel beneath her boots. The two guards at the gate barely glanced at her. Young, cocky, and dripping with the kind of arrogance that came from holding a rifle, but never facing a real war, they took one look at her age late 40s, maybe 50. Sand smirked. Consultant, huh? One muttered, scanning her paperwork lazily. You're here for the drone project? Building's that way. Just don't get in the way. He didn't wait for her reply. Just turned back to his phone. She nodded once, saying nothing. Her name was Eleanor Blake, and she walked past them like she hadn't heard the insult at all. But she had. Inside the main hangar, the air shifted from scorching heat to sterile cold. Harsh fluorescent lights glared down on sleek consoles, wires, servers, and a centerpiece. The AURORA drone, a prototype reconnaissance machine worth billions, shaped like obsidian and cloaked in failure. Engineers and pilots filled the space, young, brilliant, loud. The best from Caltech, MIT, and the Air Force Academy. They were barking at screens, arguing over feedback loops and neural interference. Nobody looked up when she entered. Nobody noticed the quiet woman who walked to a corner and set her bag down next to a forgotten terminal. She didn't speak. She simply observed. For 2 hours, she stood there motionless, not scribbling notes, not asking questions, just watching. Not the people, the data, the drone, the rhythm of electricity, the patterns behind the chaos. Then came Colonel Travis Mercertall, rigid, decorated. The kind of man who measured worth by ribbons and orders obeyed. He didn't introduce himself when he entered the observation room. He didn't have to. His presence filled it like authority always does. He held her filer, rather, a single redacted sheet pretending to be one. MS. Blake, he said without looking at her, flipping the page like it offended him. You've got field experience with remote systems, is that correct? His tone made it clear. He didn't buy it. Across the room, Captain Drew Harlan, the lead test pilot, laughed under his breath. Handsome, sharp-jawed, and dripping with bravado, he leaned against the console with an amused smirk. With all due respect, Colonel, he said, eyes never leaving the drone on the screen, we've got pilots with 4,000 flight hours and engineers holding 2 PhDs. We really don't need a babysitter right now. Mercer gave a dismissive nod, not to Harlan, but to Blake. So I'll ask you directly, MS. Blake, what exactly do you think you can contribute here? Eleanor didn't bristle. She didn't flinch or smile. She simply turned her gaze from the drone to the colonel. I'm here to observe, she said calmly. That was it. Mercer looked annoyed. Harlan outright scoffed. Observe, he echoed sarcastically, already turning back to his screen. Great. We'll try not to crash anything too spectacularly while you're observing. Mercer waved her off. Just stay out of the way. And just like that, the room moved on without her. But she stayed, and she watched. That night, the young engineers joked behind her back, calling her the Shadow and the Scribe because of the small notebook she kept by her side. Some even bet on how long she'd last before giving up and heading back to Washington. But she didn't leave. For 3 days, she stood quietly in that same corner, moving only to follow the power flows, glancing at data charts they didn't bother to read, and tracing the rhythms of the drone's behavior that no one else noticed. What they saw as system failure, she saw as symptoms. Where they forced commands, she sensed resistance. They spoke about the drone like it was an animal refusing to be tamed. Eleanor didn't see it that way. She saw a wounded partner, a thing that wasn't malfunctioning but misunderstood. It was on the evening of the 3rd day, during a particularly disastrous test flight, that she let her guard slip. As an engineer cursed at a monitor, Eleanor pushed her sleeve up to adjust her wristwatch, and for a moment, the tattoo on her inner arm showed. A ghost intertwined with a raven's feather. One of the youngest techs paused, blinking. "What's that?" he whispered to no one in particular. But she had already pulled the sleeve back down. None of them knew what it meant. Not yet. They would. And sooner than they expected. Because the next morning, a 4-star general was scheduled to arrive. The AURORA drone would be put to its final test. Billions of dollars. A decade of research. And Colonel Mercer's entire career everything was riding on a machine that had never once flown a successful mission. And the woman they all dismissed was about to change everything. The day of the demonstration arrived with the weight of judgment. The hangar was tense, humming with nervous energy. Engineers were snapping at each other. Pilots were silently running through failure scenarios in their heads. Everyone knew the stakes. If this flight failed, the AURORA program would be scrapped, and every person in that room would wear the stain of defeat. Colonel Mercer paced in front of the main control console like a man walking on glass. His reputation was on the line. His jaw was tight, his voice clipped as he barked orders. At the center of it all, Captain Drew Harlan stood with his neural headset in hand, his trademark smirk flickering with just enough anxiety to reveal the truth wasn't as confident as he pretended to be. "All right," Mercer said, voice sharp. "Captain, take the AURORA out." Smooth and steady. "No heroics." "Yes, sir," Harlan replied, slipping the headset on like it was a crown. He shot a glance at Eleanor Blake, who was leaning against the far wall, silent, hands folded loosely in front of her. He grinned. "Enjoy the show, MS. Observer. Maybe you'll finally see what a real pilot can do." Eleanor's expression didn't change. She didn't rise to the bait. She didn't need to. The launch sequence began. The sleek black drone lifted from the platform with eerie precision, its obsidian surface swallowing the light. On the big screen, the feed from its onboard cameras filled the rune-jagged canyons, open desert, the kind of terrain where a single miscalculation could end the mission in seconds. For the first 5 minutes, everything was flawless. Harlan navigated the winding rock formations with confidence, weaving through sharp turns, his voice steady over the comms. Engineers exchanged relieved glances. Maybe, just maybe, this would work. And then the alarm started. A faint tremor appeared on the video feed, just a flicker, like static, but Eleanor saw it instantly. She straightened from her corner, her sharp eyes fixed on the monitors. "What's happening?" Mercer barked. "Feedback spike," one of the engineers stammered. "We're losing the neural link." "I'm losing control," Harlan shouted, panic cracking through his voice. "The drone's fighting me, I can't." On the screen, the AURORA pitched violently, its elegant flight turning into chaos. The drone spiraled, heading straight for a sheer canyon wall. "Override," Mercer yelled. "Shut it down." "We can't," another engineer cried. "The loop is stuck, it's feeding directly into his brain." Harlan screamed, clutching the neural headset, eyes wide with pain. The room erupted into chaos, shouts, scrambled orders, frantic hands pounding on keyboards. Mercer froze for a split second, his career flashing before his eyes as the Dronia billion-dollar marvel hurtled toward destruction. And in the middle of it all, Eleanor Blake moved. She didn't run. She walked, calm, deliberate, like a shadow cutting through the storm. Nobody noticed her at first. Nobody realized she'd crossed to an old maintenance console, shoved into a corner, its screen glowing dimly like it had been forgotten by time. Her fingers met the keyboard, and then they began to fly. She wasn't typing like the engineers did, slamming commands into stubborn code. Her movements were smooth, fluid, like playing a piano she knew by heart. She wasn't fighting the drone system. She was speaking to it. The monitors blinked. A hidden channel opened. Data rerouted. In less than 4 seconds, the spiraling drone seconds away from crashing froze midair. The room went dead silent. No alarms. No chaos. Just a black shape hovering in perfect stillness against the canyon wall. Then, with a movement so graceful it looked almost alive, the AURORA turned 180 degrees in place. It floated back on course, gliding down the canyon like nothing had happened. Every eye turned toward the forgotten console. Toward her. Eleanor Blake didn't even look up. She finished the last keystroke, withdrew her hands, and stepped back. Her expression didn't change, but her presence filled the room like gravity. Quiet, unshakable, commanding. "What did you do?" Mercer's voice broke the silence, stripped of all the arrogance he'd carried just hours ago. Eleanor finally turned her head, her calm gaze meeting his. "The neural interface isn't meant to be forced," she said softly. "You were trying to command it. It doesn't respond to commands. It needs to be guided." The engineers exchanged bewildered looks. Mercer opened his mouth, but no words came out. Even Harlan, pale and shaking, could only stare at her with wide, stunned eyes. From the back of the room, a gravelly voice spoke. "Ghost Recon," someone muttered. Everyone turned. It was the old master sergeant, one of the few men there with more scars than medals. He squinted at her like he'd seen a ghost. "I heard about a pilot once. A whisper pilot. She could fly anything, sync with machines like they were part of her." His gaze locked on Eleanor. They called her Echo. The name hit the room like thunder. Eleanor didn't react. Not a flicker of emotion crossed her face. But the silence that followed was deafening. For the first time, the swagger in the room evaporated. Every engineer, every pilot, every officer was staring at her not as a consultant, not as an outsider, but as something else entirely. Something legendary. And tomorrow, they'd find out just how legendary she really was. Because the general, who had seen everything from stealth bombers to orbital satellites, had just ordered a new test. One far harder than anything the AURORA had faced before. A test that no one believed could be passed. No one except her. The morning of the final trial felt different. No one was laughing anymore. No offhand jokes. No dismissive glances toward the quiet woman in the corner. Eleanor Blake walked into the hangar, and the entire room seemed to shift around her. Engineers straightened up. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Even Captain Drew Harlan, still shaken from the day before, looked down at his boots when she passed. Colonel Mercer approached her with a completely different tone, one that carried not arrogance, but respect. "Ms. Blake," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "The general has requested one final test, an unscheduled one. It's going to be challenging. Are you prepared to pilot the AURORA?" Eleanor didn't blink. "Yes," she replied, as if the answer had always been waiting. The general, a stern man with silver hair and a reputation for never being impressed, stood in the back of the room with his aides. His expression was hard to read, but there was a sharp curiosity in his eyes as he watched her take the seat at the primary command console. "This mission," Mercer announced to the room, "is designed to simulate a real-world deep infiltration. The Targeta shielded vehicle has been hidden somewhere across 500 square miles of terrain. We filled the area with decoy signals, jammers, and thermal traps. You'll have to locate it, and you'll have 2 hours before the window closes." A murmur rippled through the room. Even the engineers knew this was a setup for failure. No human pilot had ever succeeded in a search this dense, and the AURORA's sensors, as advanced as they were, had never outsmarted the electronic chaff. But Eleanor simply lowered the neural headset over her temples. "Starting link," an operator said nervously. The monitors lit up, streams of data flowing like rivers. Normally, the neural interface produced jagged spikes, chaotic graphs as pilots struggled to control the drone. But now the lines were smooth, rhythmic, as if the machine had been waiting for her. She launched the AURORA. The drone rose into the morning sky, its black frame slicing through the desert air. Eleanor didn't jerk the controls or issue abrupt commands. She guided it softly, almost intuitively, letting the drone find its balance like a bird catching the wind. Minutes turned to hours. While other pilots relied on brute force, Eleanor blended with the machine. She didn't just look through its camera. She felt through the wind shifts, the subtle temperature changes, the patterns in the dust that no algorithm could detect. At one point, Drew Harlan leaned toward Mercer and whispered, "She's not flying it, she's wearing it." The room was silent except for the hum of the servers. Every engineer and pilot had their eyes glued to the big screen, watching the AURORA weave through valleys and over ridges with an elegance that seemed almost alive. But as time ticked on, doubt crept in. The search area was massive. The decoys were everywhere. The general began checking his watch, murmuring to his aide, Even Mercer's jaw tightened again. Was this impossible, after all? Then Eleanor spoke, her voice calm and clear. Target acquired. The screen zoomed in on a rocky overhang miles away. Camouflage netting and decoy heat signatures had hidden the vehicle so well that even advanced thermal scans missed it. But not her. The Aurora hovered above the target, pinning it like a hawk over its prey. The control room erupted. Cheers, applause, disbelief. Engineers who had doubted her were suddenly shouting her name. Harlan shook his head, muttering, "No way. No one could do that." "Who is she?" Colonel Mercer, still stunned, turned toward the general. "Sir, I think we just saved this program." The general didn't respond immediately. He was staring at Eleanor. "No," he said finally. "She didn't just save the program. She showed us what it's capable of when handled by someone extraordinary." At that moment, a notification popped up on Mercer's personal terminal. It was an encrypted message from the Pentagonized-only clearance. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it. The unredacted file of Eleanor Blake appeared on the screen, and for a moment, the colonel forgot how to breathe. Subject: Eleanor M. Blake. Former unit: Joint Special Operations Command, Task Force Ghost Recon. Designation: Call sign Echo. Status: Officially deceased. Last known operation: Nightfall. Sole survivor. Mercer turned pale. Before he could process it, one of the generals aides a man with a scar over his left eye stepped forward. He had been silent all morning, but now he was staring at Eleanor with an expression of shock and recognition. "My God," he whispered. "It's you." The room froze. Everyone looked at him. "What do you mean?" Harlan asked, confusion lacing his voice. The aide, now identified as Colonel Ryan, took a step closer, his voice trembling. "I was a junior analyst on Operation Nightfall. I heard her voice over the comms long after her entire team went silent. We thought Echo died that night. We thought everyone did." The engineers glanced at each other, murmuring. Ghost Recon, the Whisper pilot, the legend that no one believed was real. And here she was, sitting calmly at the console like she'd never left the shadows. Eleanor Blake couldn't confirm or deny it. She simply removed the neural headset and placed it gently on the table, as if the revelation didn't matter. But it mattered. The silence in the hangar was profound. For the first time, Drew Harlan wasn't smirking. He was standing, his face pale, his ego shattered by the realization that the woman he'd mocked wasn't just skilled. She was something beyond comprehension. The general's aide stood to full attention, his voice steady now. And then, with a sharp motion, he saluted. Not a casual salute. A soldier's salute. One of deep, unshakable respect. The entire room followed suit. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still. They weren't just saluting Eleanor Blake. They were saluting Echo. The hangar was so silent that the hum of the servers sounded like a drumbeat. Every person in the room, engineers, pilots, soldiers, stood frozen in salute. Their eyes were locked on Eleanor Blake, the woman who, just days ago, had been treated like an afterthought. Now, they looked at her as though a living legend had walked out of a classified file into their lives. Eleanor didn't return the salute. She didn't need to. Instead, she offered a single, slow-noted acknowledgement that carried more weight than any words could. Colonel Mercer lowered his hand first, stepping forward, his voice stripped of all the bluster it once held. "MS. Blake," he said softly, "or should I say Echo? What you did today, what you just showed use, is something I've never witnessed in my entire career." Her calm eyes met his, and for a moment, Mercer felt like a junior cadet, again standing in the presence of someone who had walked through fire and returned stronger. He opened his mouth to speak again, but stopped when she quietly gathered her small leather notebook and tucked it under her arm. Her silence was deliberate. She didn't need validation. She never had. The general finally stepped forward, his face unreadable. "Task Force Ghost Recon," he said slowly. "I thought all of you were gone." Eleanor didn't reply. Her hand brushed her wrist for a brief moment, the faded tattoo hidden under her sleeve, the ghost intertwined with the raven's feather. A reminder of missions no one would ever speak of. A reminder of lives lost in shadows where no cameras or medals existed. "I'll be blunt," the general continued, his tone shifting to something almost personal. "You've just saved one of the most expensive programs in the Pentagon's portfolio. But But I suspect that's not why you're here, is it? Eleanor tilted her head slightly. I'm here because the Aurora deserves to fly, she said, her voice quiet yet firm. It's not a weapon to be forced. It's a partner. You don't command something like this, you listen to it. The engineers, who had spent years wrestling with code and hardware, glanced at each other, humbled. For the first time, they understood the problem had never been the machinite had been their mindset. Captain Harlan stood at the back, his earlier arrogance long gone. He looked like someone who had seen a ghost and realized that he'd been mocking a legend. His voice cracked when he spoke. Ma'am, I didn't know who you were. Eleanor's eyes softened just enough to acknowledge him. You didn't need to, she replied. The general gave a decisive nod. The program is safe. The Aurora will continue, and I want you leading this, Echo. Eleanor shook her head slightly. I'm not here for titles. I'll help you get it ready, but after that I go where I'm needed. Mercer frowned. After what you've done, you can have any post you want. Why walk away? She simply gave a faint smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. Because the people who trained me, the people who wore this tattoo, her sleeve shifted just enough to reveal the faint outline of the ghost and feather. They're not here to see this. I'm just the echo of what they left behind. Her words hit like a quiet storm. Even the youngest technician felt the gravity of her past missions no one talked about, sacrifices that were never recorded in history books. The general's aide, Colonel Kane, took a step forward. I remember your voice, he said softly. That night on comms during Operation Nightfall, you kept transmitting until the end. I thought you were gone. Eleanor's gaze didn't waver. Ghosts don't vanish, she said. We just fade in the background until we're needed again. As the sun dipped low over the Nevada desert, casting long shadows across the hangar floor, Eleanor packed her duffel bag. The Aurora drone, now safely docked and powered down, gleamed like black glass in the dim light. She placed a hand on its fuselage, a silent moment of connection between pilot and machine. Colonel Mercer approached quietly. He held out her leather notebook. You left this, he said, his voice almost hesitant. She took it from him, her fingers brushing his just for an instant. That brief contact felt like a charge of something unspoken history. Respect, loss. Mercer swallowed hard. I misjudged you. Eleanor gave him a long, level look. You weren't the first. You won't be the last. He nodded, understanding. Still, I'm sorry. She didn't respond with words. Instead, she slung the duffel over her shoulder and walked toward the massive hangar doors. Every person in the room turned to watch her go. There was no applause, no fanfare, just the heavy silence of people who knew they were witnessing something rare. Outside, the desert wind carried the last colors of sunset orange bleeding into purple, the sky painted like a memory. Eleanor paused at the threshold of the hangar, looking back once. Inside, the engineers who had dismissed her now stood like statues, their faces etched with respect. Captain Harlan lowered his head. The general gave a slight nod. Colonel Mercer, once so rigid, simply stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his expression stripped of pride. Eleanor's eyes swept over them one final time before she stepped into the fading light. The hangar doors rumbled closed behind her. Greatness doesn't shout. It doesn't need a title, a medal, or permission to exist. It walks quietly, does the impossible, and leaves behind a legacy that speaks for itself. Eleanor Blakehecker reminded everyone that real power isn't about control. It's about connection. And sometimes, the strongest people are the ones you dismiss without a second thought. Never underestimate the quiet ones. The people who don't brag, who don't demand attention theory, often the ones who carry entire histories on their shoulders. They've already fought battles you'll never see. And when the time comes, they rise not to prove you wrong, but to do what must be done. As Eleanor's silhouette faded into the desert horizon, the entire base felt Ida's presence leaving, but not gone. She wasn't just a consultant, or a pilot, or even a survivor. She was Echo, and some legends don't need words to be remembered.